For this lecture, we're still in Chapter 1 of Doing Ethics by Louis Vaughan, and we're going to spend some time in this chapter looking at one specific issue that comes under the section of the relationship between religion and ethics. And the issue that we're going to be looking at is an idea that is commonly referred to as divine command theory. Now, this idea simply says that right actions are those actions that are willed by God. So this is coming out of a religious worldview that is making an argument that moral principles, moral truths, would not exist if it wasn't for the existence of God. So morality, ethics is rooted in the nature and character of God. And there is a famous response to this that can sometimes be confusing, and I think it might be helpful for us to briefly go over it. If you want to know what else the chapter says about the relationship between religion and ethics, you'll need to just read the chapter, and you'll definitely want to do that before taking the quiz. But here I think it's helpful for us to look at this famous dilemma that appears. It's actually a response to divine command theory, and this dilemma appears in a dialogue written by the philosopher Plato. So it's a very old dilemma where Socrates is asking a guy named Euthyphro. So this is why it's called the Euthyphro dilemma. Socrates asks Euthyphro, is an action morally right because God wills it to be so, or does God will it to be so because it's morally right? So if we think about this dilemma in the first horn of the dilemma, we might say that God exists and that there's a moral standard that exists independent of God, but the standard is also above God. Well, if you say that God wills something to be so because it's morally right, then what you're saying, essentially, is that there's a moral standard above God by which God is making moral decisions. Well, this seems to presumably lead to a problem, because if you accept this side of the dilemma, then it seems to be the case that God is not the highest standard for morality. And most religious people want to affirm that God is the highest standard of morality. And so this is a tough pill to swallow if you accept that notion. It also suggests that morality can exist without God. And so if morality can exist without God, then divine command theory is false because you don't need God for morality. On the other hand, you could flip this around and say, no, whatever is good is because it's that which God wills. So on this side of the dilemma, you want to say that God is above the moral standard, and God is actually the one that's dictating the moral standard. Well, if you take this side, then it's good, you might say if you're a religious believer, that God is higher than the standard. That's the positive of this side. The potential negative of this side is that the moral standard now seems to be arbitrary. Because couldn't God just say anything is moral? So if God says that murder is moral, then presumably that would have to be moral because God is making the decision for it to be moral. And so if this is the case, the argument against it is it just makes morality arbitrary or just random based upon whatever God wants to say is moral. So these are the two horns of the dilemma that Socrates is putting out there when asking this question to Euthyphro. If you accept one side, then you have morality above God, and that seems to suggest that God is not necessary for morality. If you go on the other side, then it seems like the moral standards are simply arbitrary based upon whatever God decides. So there is a potential resolution to this problem, and that is some religious believers will say, in reality, God just is the moral standard. Now, when you start thinking about ethics this way, you really get into a basic meta-ethical question. And that basic meta-ethical question is, what is the nature of morality? So whether or not you buy this religious solution to the Euthyphro dilemma, that God simply is the moral standard. Whether you buy it or not, it certainly forces us to think about what is the nature of morality to begin with. So, for example, could a moral standard exist without a person who determines the standard? So could there be moral standards floating? I mean, not materially floating, but floating as an idea, perhaps. This is actually how Plato would have thought about it, that there are actually ideas, moral ideas, that exist in what Plato calls the realm of the forms, and we can access those standards and those ideas by reflection, by thought, by thinking. And so is that how moral standards exist? They just kind of float out there as rules saying things like do not lie, do not steal, do not murder, whatever those moral standards might be. Can those exist without a person determining that those standards exist? If you say no, moral standards can't exist without a person determining them, then you might find the religious argument persuasive here. And that argument simply says that for morality to exist, there must be a person to determine moral standards. And who's a better person than God to determine those standards? If you don't find this persuasive, that a person is necessary for morality, then you might not buy the religious argument here. But either way, wherever you fall in this debate, it forces us to think about the meta-ethical question of what is morality? Morality that doesn't seem to be reduced to physical things, so it's not like chemistry that you can study in a laboratory and do experiments. Morality seems to have a very different nature. And what is it? Well, however you answer what is the nature of morality, you are engaging in metaethics. So this concludes our second lecture for this chapter. I recommend that you go through and you read the chapter in its entirety because we didn't cover everything. So make sure that you read the entire chapter before you take this week's quiz.